There's this really profound biological paradox hiding right in the fossil record.
Yeah, and it completely upends how we usually think about evolution.
Right, because if you engineer the absolute perfect apex predator, an animal with almost 19 million years of unchecked global dominance.
Right, armed with a 40,000-pound bite force.
Exactly, and a body the size of a modern submarine. Logic dictates that a species like that should be practically immortal.
You'd think so, yeah. It should be invincible.
But if you look at the ocean today, that ultimate killing machine is just, well, it's entirely erased. And the slow, blubbery, seemingly defenseless whales that it preyed upon, they're still here, swimming in every ocean on Earth.
It's incredible. We're looking at a scenario where the invincible died out and the vulnerable inherited the planet.
It really is wild. So today, we are taking a deep dive into an exhaustive new analysis from the YouTube channel Apex Truth.
A phenomenal breakdown, by the way.
Oh, absolutely. Our mission today is basically to tear down the Hollywood myth of the Megalodon, get into the actual chilling mechanics of its biology, and look at the cutting-edge science that just redefined what this monster looked like.
And ultimately figure out the ecological trap that starved the greatest predator in history.
Because the scientific reckoning this creature has undergone recently is just staggering.
It really is. For over a century, the paleontology community essentially suffered from a collective lack of imagination.
Which is easy to do when all you have are these massive, terrifying teeth.
Exactly. They looked at the modern ocean, found the great white shark, and essentially just hit the scale up button on a photocopier.
Right, the assumption was always direct ancestry. But they aren't even from the same immediate family tree.
Not at all. The Megalodon belonged to the Autodontids, which is a completely extinct lineage.
So the resemblance in their teeth is really strictly a case of convergent evolution.
Yeah, when you hunt the same large, blubbery prey, nature just inevitably engineers the exact same serrated cutting tools.
It's like how a dolphin and an entirely unrelated ichthyosaur both end up looking like torpedoes.
Precisely. But that faulty great white assumption, it colored every museum exhibit, every documentary for 100 years.
Right, it created this image of a massive, barrel-shaped brawler.
Yeah, and it wasn't until a landmark 2025 study, this was conducted by 28 international scientists analyzing a specimen from Belgium.
Specimen IRSB 9893, right?
That's the one. That study completely threw the old morphological model out the window.
And that Belgian specimen is kind of the Rosetta Stone here because of what it actually preserved.
Right, because sharks are cartilaginous. They don't leave behind dense bone skeletons like a T-Rex would.
But IRSB 9893 contained, 141 associated vertebrae from a single individual?
Yeah, which is unheard of. That allowed researchers to definitively measure the trunk, and the torso alone was over 36 feet long.
Oh, wow. So when you try to apply the bulky proportions of a great white to a 36-foot spine,
the physics simply tear themselves apart.
It just doesn't work.
No, the biomechanical failure is twofold there. First, you have the square cube law.
Right, where as an animal scales up, its volume and mass increase way faster than its surface area.
Exactly. So if you take that girthy shape of a great white and scale it up to 50 or 60 feet, the sheer mass of water displacement creates this unsustainable drag coefficient.
The animal would just expend a catastrophic amount of energy just trying to move forward.
Right. And second, cartilage has load-bearing limits. A barrel-shaped megalodon would lack the structural integrity to endure the mechanical stress of its own swimming motions.
It would literally buckle under its own mass against the ocean's drag.
Exactly. So the actual anatomy had to be drastically different.
Which means the Hollywood tank model gives way to something much more refined.
Yeah, the closest anatomical analog isn't a great white at all. It's more like a scaled-up, elongated creature. Think of a modern lemon shark or a blue shark.
So, less of a submarine and more of an oceanic glider.
Right. It needed to traverse entire ocean basins with minimal caloric burn. That elongated body drastically reduces drag.
But it would require a completely different stabilization system, wouldn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It would have needed unusually long pectoral fins just to generate the hydrodynamic lift to keep that massive torso from sinking.
Which honestly paints a much more terrifying picture to me.
Oh, for sure.
We're talking about an 80-foot, highly specialized glider built to cross oceans efficiently, but capped off with this completely disproportionate flattened snout.
A snout built specifically to anchor hyperdeveloped jaw muscles.
Right, optimized for one singular violent impact. A 40,000-pound bite force designed to just shatter the rib cages of whales.
And the mechanics of that bite force were fascinating because it wasn't just about clamping down.
It was about dismantling, right?
Exactly. The teeth were angled and serrated to maximize shearing against thick blubber and dense bone. It systematically dismantled its prey.
But that level of kinetic output, combined with its ocean-crossing biology, that introduces a massive metabolic problem.
The very problem that eventually sealed its fate. Yeah.
Right, and this is where we get into the concept of regional endothermy. Basically, the Megalodon was running a biological furnace.
He was warm-blooded, essentially. In parts of its body, anyway.
But how do we actually prove that? Because, when you don't have fossilized organs or tissue, and all you have are teeth that turned to stone millions of years ago.
How do you take the temperature of a ghost?
Exactly. What is the actual mechanism there?
Well, the answer lies in clumped isotope paleothermometry.
Which is just a brilliant piece of geochemical detective work.
It really is. Basically, when a shark forms its teeth, the enamel captures oxygen and carbon isotopes from the surrounding water.
Okay.
And carbon-13 and oxygen-18 tend to bond together, or clump, much more frequently at lower temperatures.
So by measuring that specific ratio of clumped isotopes in the fossilized teeth.
Right, and then comparing them to the surrounding marine sedimentary rock to establish the ambient ocean temperature.
Scientists can literally map the thermal gradient. It leaves a permanent temperature signature right in the enamel.
Yes. And the isotopes unequivocally show that Megalodon maintained a body temperature significantly higher than the surrounding ocean water.
Especially in its brain, eyes, and red swimming muscle.
Exactly, which grants a massive tactical advantage.
A warmer brain processes sensory information faster.
And warmer muscles contract with explosive speed. It was hunting in high definition while its cold-blooded prey and competitors were basically lagging.
But, running an 80-foot biological wetsuit like that requires an astronomical caloric budget.
Oh, an absurd amount of food.
Which brings us perfectly to the internet's absolute favorite theory.
Yes, the Mariana Trench theory.
Right, the idea that a remnant population of megalodons just retreated into the abyssal zones and are still down there hiding today.
It's a fun idea for movies, but biologically, it's impossible.
Well, people always point to deep-sea gigantism to support it. Like we have the colossal squid and massive sleeper sharks down there. So why couldn't an adaptable predator just shift its hunting grounds downward?
Because it's a fundamental misunderstanding of the metabolic limits of macropredation. Abyssal gigantism works entirely differently.
Right, because the deep ocean is basically an energetic desert.
Exactly. Things like the colossal squid and the Greenland shark survive down there by operating on a metabolic razor's edge.
The Greenland shark is incredibly cold-blooded and moves so slowly, it's essentially just drifting, right?
Yeah, it might eat only a few times a year. A regionally warm-blooded 80-foot predator is a high-performance engine. It requires immense constant fuel.
It's like the difference between a solar-powered calculator and a massive diesel generator.
That's a perfect analogy. The generator is vastly more powerful, but if you put it in a place with no fuel, it shuts down immediately.
And the deep ocean just doesn't have the blubbery, high-calorie whale populations required to keep that internal furnace burning?
Not to mention the oxygen problem. The deep ocean has incredibly low levels of dissolved oxygen compared to the surface.
Oh, right. An active, massive endothermic shark would need a huge rate of oxygen exchange over its gills just to power that red muscle tissue.
So dropping a megalodon into the Mariana Trench would result in rapid asphyxiation and starvation almost instantly.
It just biologically cannot exist there.
Yeah.
But despite the physics and the biology ruling it out, the survival myth just persists. We constantly hear about that famous 1918 sighting by Australian fishermen.
Right, the guys who supposedly saw a massive pale shark consume their heady pots.
Yeah, or people point to the coelacanth,
Yeah.
a fish we thought died out 66 million years ago until one was just hauled up in 1938.
Sure, the ocean is massive and we've explored very little of it, but the megalodon leaves behind a very specific type of biological debris.
The conveyor belt of teeth.
Exactly. A single shark sheds tens of thousands of teeth in its lifetime.
So if there were a breeding population of 80-foot apex predators roaming any ocean on Earth today,
We would find modern bioapatite teeth washing up all the time. We find fossilized teeth everywhere, but a fossil takes millions of years to mineralize and turn to stone.
and we have never found a fresh, white, unmineralized megalodon tooth.
Never, not a single one.
And, beyond the taphonomy of the teeth, there is an even larger living proof of its extinction. It's what you might call the negative fingerprint on the current ecosystem.
I love that term. Yeah, if you look at the evolutionary history of baleen whales, their timeline tells the entire story.
Because the immense size of today's whales is actually a direct reaction to the removal of their primary predator, isn't it?
That's exactly it. During the Miocene epoch, when Megalodon was at its absolute peak, most baleen whales were relatively small.
Like, 15 to 25 feet long?
Great, they were bite-sized. It was only after the Megalodon completely disappeared from the fossil record that baleen whales experienced this explosive evolutionary leap in size.
Eventually producing the 100-foot blue whale.
Exactly.
Because growing to 100 feet is actually a massive liability if there is a predator out there big enough to take a 6-foot bite out of your flank.
Yeah, you can't maneuver, you can't hide, you just become a massive, slow-moving buffet.
But the moment the apex predator is removed from the equation, being enormous suddenly becomes a huge advantage for a filter feeder.
It allows for better thermoregulation in cold water and the ability to migrate thousands of miles between feeding grounds.
So the sheer existence of the blue whale is quite literally the ecological shadow left behind by the death of the Megalodon.
It is living proof that the ocean's size ceiling was suddenly left unguarded.
Wow. So, okay, we have established it didn't retreat to the deep, and it wasn't out-evolved by some larger, scarier monster. So how exactly did a 19 million year dynasty just quietly collapse?
It comes down to geology and climate. Around 3.6 million years ago, the Earth fundamentally rearranged its plumbing.
The closure of the Isthmus of Panama.
Yes, it was one of the most consequential tectonic events in modern geological history.
Because previously, the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans flowed freely into one another at the equator.
Right, creating this warm, global, tropical current. But as the tectonic plates shifted, the land bridge between North and South America rose up and sealed that gap entirely.
Which severed the equatorial current. And the warm water that used to flow into the Pacific was suddenly forced northward along the American coast,
creating the Gulf Stream.
And this is where the cascade effect really begins. The Gulf Stream carried massive amounts of moisture up to the Arctic. That moisture fell as snow, which didn't melt, leading to this massive expansion of the polar ice caps.
And the growth of those ice caps locked up a tremendous amount of the Earth's water, which caused global sea levels to just plummet.
So the warm, shallow coastal seas that the Megalodon relied on for pupping and hunting, they began to drain and disappear.
But more importantly, the oceans cooled dramatically.
Right, and the whales, with their thick layers of blubber, they adapted to the cold. They began migrating toward those newly formed freezing polar waters where krill populations were just exploding.
But the Megalodon, chained to its regional endothermy, couldn't follow them.
Its internal furnace was powerful, but it couldn't overcome freezing polar waters without burning more calories than it could possibly consume.
It was locked out of the new global dining room.
Trapped in shrinking patches of warm water, just watching its primary food source migrate out of reach.
But starvation is rarely a solitary killer in nature. As the Megalodon's territory shrank, it was forced into direct competition with a much newer, much more adaptable predator.
The ancestor of the modern great white shark.
Exactly.
It feels almost insulting to a creature like the Megalodon. You have this massive, specialized hypercar dominating the road, but suddenly a global fuel shortage hits. And right as the gas stations are drying up, this highly fuel-efficient compact car just rolls onto the scene.
That is exactly what happened.
Wow.
And the trophic evidence for this competition is staggering. Researchers use nitrogen-15 isotope analysis to determine an animal's position in the food web.
Because as you move higher up the food chain, nitrogen-15 accumulates in the tissues and bone, right?
Yes. And the isotope signatures of early great whites overlap almost perfectly with the Megalodon during this period.
So they were hunting in the exact same waters, targeting the same remaining prey.
But the great white could do it at a fraction of the metabolic cost. They didn't need a massive whale to sustain themselves. A seal or a smaller fish would suffice.
They could survive the lean times that were actively starving the Megalodon.
And on top of outcompeting the adults, these new predators likely targeted the Megalodon's coastal nurseries.
Oh, because as sea levels dropped, those nurseries lost their natural shallow water protection.
Right. And great whites are incredibly opportunistic. The juvenile Megalodons, which were already facing a depleted food supply, suddenly found themselves being hunted.
So the reproductive pipeline of the entire species was being severed at the exact moment adult mortality was spiking due to starvation.
It is the ultimate tragedy of hyperspecialization.
Yeah, every single trait that made the Megalodon the undisputed king of the ocean, its bulk, its warm-blooded engine, its specialized jaws, they all became massive evolutionary liabilities the second the climate changed.
It was perfectly engineered for a world that simply stopped existing. Evolution does not reward absolute power, you know. It rewards plasticity.
The Megalodon was a victim of its own success.
It really was. It became so perfectly adapted to those specific Miocene conditions that it lost the genetic flexibility to survive anything else. The great white didn't overpower the Megalodon, it simply outlasted it by requiring less of a dying world.
Wow. It's a really sobering look at how fragile even the most dominant biology really is.
Yeah.
I mean, the 19 million year reign of the greatest predator in Earth's history didn't end with a cataclysm. It ended with a quiet, starving whimper in a cooling ocean.
Yeah, swallowed by time and a changing climate.
But, you know, as we look at the climate today, that history offers a rather chilling intellectual prompt. Our oceans are currently warming at an unprecedented rate. The polar ice is melting and global currents are shifting once again.
Potentially recreating the exact warm, shallow coastal ecosystems that birthed the Megalodon 20 million years ago.
Exactly. So if the environmental locks that kept macropredators in check are breaking down and the ocean's negative fingerprint is shifting, what dormant evolutionary pressures might wake up in today's marine predators? If the throne of the warm water giant is being rebuilt by modern climate change, what exactly is going to evolve to sit on it next?
Well, the environment always dictates the biology. If you rebuild the arena, nature will eventually engineer a new gladiator.
Something to think about the next time you look out at the water. That does it for today's deep dive. Stay curious.